investigate the word that I introduced in vocabulary on Monday, and that word is biodiversity. So we're going to look today at human actions that are going to impact biodiversity. So what exactly is biodiversity? Well, remember, you can take a look at your vocabulary, which some of you wrote into your actual school notebook, or you can go back to the lesson on Monday and take a look at that vocabulary there. So what exactly is biodiversity? You'll notice I have half the definition here, but I've covered up some of the key words. So hopefully, if you notice, the first missing word is that biodiversity is a measure. It's a measurement. Just like something like height would be a measurement, or temperature. So biodiversity is a measure of the variety of Earth's organisms, including their genetic diversity. So biodiversity is a measurement we have of how much diversity is out there. So how many different kinds of plants and animals do we have, including their genetic diversity, right? So within a species, like say a species of sea otters, right? How different are they from each other at their genetic level? So biodiversity is this really big measurement, but it helps us get a better feel for what's actually happening in ecosystems. It kind of gives us like a measuring tape to use when we look at what's happening to organisms in their environment. So we're going to explore today 3 major actions that humans do that has a negative impact on biodiversity. So we're going to be looking today at habitat destruction. We're going to be looking at what are called introduced or invasive species, and then we'll be looking at this large category that's called overexploitation. These are some pictures here that give you a little bit of a clue of what we're going to be talking about. This is a really big topic. I could spend days and days and days, a different video episode for each part of this. Today I'm going to kind of introduce the big picture. I'm going to touch briefly on each of these topics. So we're going to start with the one that you might be a little bit more familiar with, and that one is habitat destruction, also what we call deforestation. Because if we cut down or we rip out or we destroy a place that an animal or a plant lives, that's obviously really going to affect its biodiversity or the number of organisms that are going to be able to live in a place. So as you can see here, this is a picture taken from an airplane looking down at a clear-cut section of forest. Because clear-cutting is when at one time you either remove all or most of the trees in an area. And you can see that that has a huge impact. This ground that has been left behind is completely bare, right? We can see there are some other trees over there, but clear-cutting is a really destructive process. Oftentimes, when clear-cutting happens, all kinds of branches and debris are just kind of left behind because these are scraps that the timber industry isn't really going to use. And so that wood and that plant material just kind of sits there. It starts to decay and get dry. That is going to be a problem if this area is followed by, dry periods and there's maybe a lightning storm. This is obviously a forest fire situation about to happen, right? Because you've got all kinds of dry fuel sitting on the ground. This could end up wiping out the remaining parts of the trees that are there. So clear cutting doesn't just remove the trees, it destroys the environment, and also this is going to prevent future trees from being able to regrow because it's blocking their ability to poke up and out of the soil. So clear cutting is obviously bad news. A particular part of the world that's really being affected by clear cutting is clear cutting that's happening for palm oil. So if you didn't know, there's a lot of different palm species out there. Palm tree is a very broad word for all kinds of different palm tree plants that grow throughout the world. And there's a particular type that has these gigantic, they're kind of like seed pods, and they have these kind of little palm oil fruits on them. And once you pick them, you can crush them and squeeze them, and you can get juice out of them. Except we don't call it palm juice, we call it palm oil. And this palm oil is used in lots of products. In fact, more than you may have been aware of. Things like a chocolate bar, like a Kit Kat or a Milky Way. It uses palm oil. That helps to give that chocolate its kind of nice, shiny appearance. We see palm oil in things like Oreos, or an ice cream bar, or like Trick cereal, and all kinds of different beauty products like shampoos and conditioners and moisturizers. Palm oil is used as an additive in a lot of the products we buy every day. And that is a bit of a problem, because in order to make this palm oil at such a huge level of production, there has been incredible destruction of particularly Indonesian rainforests. So what's happening is, because palm oil is in such demand, right, they're going and getting rid of the natural rainforests that exist throughout large parts of Asia, getting rid of them, clear cutting them, and then replanting them as plantations in order to grow and harvest palm oil. So when you're buying these products, you're actually supporting and contributing to the clear cutting and deforestation that's happening in parts of Asia. And this is particularly bad for the animals who depend on those rainforests and those natural trees. So things like tigers, things like orangutans, things like Sumatran rhinos, they need their forest to stay the way that it is. Cutting it all down and planting these plantations is not a good thing. So one of the things that you can do is buy from companies that are not using palm oil, or they're using sustainable palm oil. Palm oil that is harvested and grown in a way that does not disrupt the natural rainforest ecosystem. Definitely do your research. This has a list of different companies that are using sustainable palm oil. It is encouraging you, when you buy your Halloween candy, right, to buy candy from these companies. So we want to make sure that what we do, the things that we buy in the store, that in some other part of the world, they're not destroying habitats and cutting down trees that animals and plants depend on. Our next way that humans have an impact on biodiversity is something that is called introduced, invasive, or alien species. And I particularly like this comic. Again, it's one of those higher level ones. We've talked about this a lot this year, that I like kind of very sophisticated comics. So here we've got some bunny rabbits, and there are some UFOs. And they say, oh, I just know this is gonna mess with the ecosystem. So this is funny, because we humans often send in creatures to ecosystems that are alien, that don't belong there. And that ends up causing some serious problem. So let's first start by defining what is an invasive, or an introduced, or an alien species. An example of an invasive plant is this picture here, which is called kudzu. It's a vine. It was originally brought from Asia to the United States sometime in the 19th century, and it's growing out of control. It will grow over top of trees, it'll grow over top of existing plants and shrubs and bushes, and it basically strangles them to death in order to steal their resources, their sunlight, and their water. And it is rampant all over parts of the southern United States. So even something like a plant that may not seem very scary can end up being really bad news when it's brought to a place it doesn't belong. Sometimes domesticated house cats don't end up staying in their houses. We have a problem with are called feral cat populations, right? These are populations of cats that are living in our kind of environment, but they're not owned by humans. And in fact, many of them have never been raised by humans, and so they're kind of sort of a wild cat. They're not really domesticated, and these guys cause huge problems to local animal populations. Even your average house cat, if you have a house cat and you allow it to go outside, it's going to kill all kinds of local birds. It's going to kill like local lizards and other kinds of reptiles that are running around in your neighborhood. So domesticated cats can be considered an invasive species because they're able to wipe out local bird populations, especially in places like a city where we don't have normal things like foxes or bobcats that might be killing birds. One of the other ways that humans affect biodiversity, and they affect it negatively, is a big category that we call overexploitation. So overexploitation is a really big category. It includes things that humans have been doing for hundreds of years. It includes things that are totally legal, and then there is the darker side of overexploitation, what we call poaching. Poaching is the illegal hunting, killing, or capturing of wildlife. So before we get into kind of the illegal side of things, let's start with what is legal. So in many countries throughout the world, as well as throughout human history, humans hunt animals. And we're not saying that that's a problem. The problem becomes when we hunt a little bit more than we need. So for example, things like fox hunting, or maybe things like bird hunting where you're shooting dozens of geese or ducks, those might be activities that we might consider a little bit excessive, right? Nobody really needs to kill dozens and dozens of birds and ducks, especially in today's world where we have supermarkets that provide us with all kinds of different meats we can eat. So these are things that are totally legal, but they still are having an impact on wildlife populations. Related to kind of hunting, we also have fishing, right? It's similar to hunting, right? We're capturing and killing animals in order for us to eat them. And unfortunately, we catch way more fish than we eat. And these pictures give you a size of the problem. These are different fish markets that exist throughout the world. And unfortunately, a lot of this fish that's brought in, it's not going to get sold. In fact, the estimate is about 25% of our global catch of fish. This also includes things like crabs or lobsters. 25% of what we catch in our nets from the ocean, we end up trashing, we end up throwing away, and we don't end up using. So if we could get a little bit better at making sure that what we are fishing is actually being eaten, that would help to lead to a lot less waste, and would also help to keep the populations of those fish species or lobster species or crab species a little bit better supported. So those are examples of ways that we legally overexploit animals, right? Catching too many of them or killing too many of them for food. But now I want to transition into the more illegal side of overexploitation. I want to start by giving a positive, and that positive is that we do have an international law in place. This law is called CITES. It stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Kind of a big, wordy name. But basically, this treaty was drawn up in 1973, where nations of the world came together and they recognized there are certain animals and plants we should not be hunting. We should not be killing them. We should not be selling them. We should not buy them because the numbers of that species are so low. They're what we call endangered or critically endangered or vulnerable. And we want to make sure that there's enough of those plants and animal species for future generations. So in 1973, nations of the world came together and this international law was created. Unfortunately, there's still lots of people out there who are open and totally willing to break this international law because they want to have access to these different plants and animals. So a way that we see this is with what is called bushmeat. Bushmeat is this kind of generic term that's used to describe wildlife that's sold for food. In many parts of the world, when you go to your local market, you might not have chicken or beef to choose from as types of meat. People are catching things that live in the forests and jungles around their home. Sometimes that might be things like small primates, it might be wild boars or wild pigs, but bushmeat is becoming a particular problem when the meat that is turning up is animals that are endangered. Bushmeat is particularly of concern when we're talking about primates. Some of you may know that we are very genetically similar to primates. We share a lot of our DNA, and so to eat their meat is really not a great idea. Diseases can pass very easily between primates and humans, and so eating their meat is not a good idea just from a safety perspective, as well as just a general, we shouldn't be eating the meat of animals who is endangered. In addition to bushmeat, right, there are all kinds of exotic foods served around the world. Now, in other parts of the world, people have different diets than we do, right? You and I would be really grossed out if we were given insects to eat. But in other parts of the world, insects are an important part of people's protein in their diets. So this picture may be a little bit shocking, right? But in other parts of the world, eating a scorpion on a stick or a starfish on a stick is not as unusual. But the problem becomes when these markets are selling organisms that are in danger. Related to things that are illegal, the pet trade is a very serious problem. Wildlife isn't just killed, wildlife is captured and kept alive and then sold to people so people can keep them in their homes, right? Things like small birds, all kinds of birds captured from the rainforest. If you've ever seen the animated movie Rio, that movie talks about that topic, about birds that are captured from the wild and sold as pets. We also have things like tigers, different kinds of small primates. These are gray African gray parrots. The illegal pet trade is a really huge problem. And some of you might know that the TV show Tiger King is been incredibly popular. And I hope that we're taking away the right message from that TV show. And that message is that people should not be owning tigers. Because tigers are endangered, there is not a lot of them left in the wild, and they are not pets. If you want a tiger as a pet, get a cat. And it's not just the things that are cute and cuddly that are being sold on the illegal pet trade market. Reptiles are also a huge part of illegal wildlife trade. So this is a picture that at first might just seem like a bunch of water bottles. But these water bottles are stuffed with snakes. So this was something that was picked up at customs when they do, bag searching. And this person had been trying to bring into a country soda bottles filled with illegal snakes and other reptiles in order to sell them in the wildlife trade. So even things like reptiles can be smuggled and sold illegally. Another part of the illegal wildlife trade is killing animals, like this rhino here, and cutting off parts of their body in order to sell them. Poaching for rhino horn is a serious problem throughout parts of Africa and Asia. There is huge demand for the horn, and you know what that horn is made of? It's made of the same material as your fingernail. It's made of a protein called keratin, and unfortunately, many rhino species have been brought to extinction or to the brink of extinction by people's demand for this rhino horn. Unfortunately, in traditional Chinese medicine, rhino horn is thought to have curative properties. There's even claims that it can help cure cancer. Of course, none of this has been verified by actual scientific studies, and yet the demand for rhino horn persists. I'm going to be talking more about rhinos next week, especially because I had the opportunity to work with rhinos this past summer. I had the opportunity to work with black rhino conservation and anti-poaching units. I was also able to meet the last 2 northern white rhinos on the earth. So rhinos are an animal that I care a lot about because I was able to help directly with their conservation efforts this past summer. In addition to rhinos, another species in both Africa and in Asia that is being hunted for its body parts are elephants, right? People hunt and kill elephants and they take their tusks, and we call that substance ivory, but ivory is just elephant tusks. Another material that is at the top of the wildlife poaching trade is pangolins. Pangolins right now are the #1 most trafficked animal in the world. Pangolins are these adorable mammals who are covered in scales, and unfortunately their scales are used in lots of traditional medicines, and these guys are being hunted to the brink of extinction. So to recap, we've just had kind of a depressing look at threats to biodiversity. We've looked at habitat destruction, also known as clear cutting. We've looked at invasive species, and we've looked at both the legal and illegal aspects of overexploitation. I know this was kind of a lot, but it's important for us to be aware of just how much humans are impacting biodiversity. And the good news is there is a solution, and that is what is called conservation, and that is going to be the focus of all next week. We're going to look at ways that we can reduce these threats to biodiversity, ways that are going to help ensure that we have a lot of different kinds of species, plants and animals, and also making sure that those species have a diversity within them and with their genetics. So again, next week we'll be focusing on conservation. Also, next week is the last bit of new information for this unit. After next week, it's going to be your turn. It's going to be project work. It's going to be you working on your human impact project. And then we're going to get going with brainstorming and deciding how you're going to work on your end of the year project. Make sure to check out the self-quiz in Google Classroom. Also check out some of the other links I posted there to other videos, and have a great rest of the week. Bye!